So, this has quickly become the talk of the community. The Times 100 Best Fantasy Books of All Time list. And while the fantasy community is reacting and recoiling from this list, rightfully saying that it's a bad list, I want to go a step further and call it out directly, because this isn't just a bad list, it's a purposefully bad list, and insidious in the process. To put this into perspective before I continue, I want to make it clear. I am not as well read in the fantasy genre as many people on BookTube, and I freely admit this. Most of these books are books I've not read, but that doesn't invalidate my points here, because you can acknowledge that you know about the subject without being intimately familiar with it. For example, I know who Robert Jordan is, and that The Wheel of Time is an influential and massive series of over a dozen fantasy novels. I know there is a general consensus that his books were heavily influenced by Tolkien early on, reached a high point a few books in, and that he was able to experiment more with his own themes beyond book 3, that they slowed in the middle in what the community calls the slog, and they improved towards the end before being handed over to Brandon Sanderson to finish with the last 3 books after the unfortunate death of Robert Jordan. I know this without having read the books, and I know plenty more about the key individuals in the fantasy genre in fantasy literature without having read all of their books as well. Even though I've not read them, I know the influence of these books and how much they've given back to the genre. So, when I sit here and tell you that Time magazine put together a top 100 fantasy books list with a panel of judges and didn't at any point mention or give credit to any of the following: Robin Hobb, Joe Abercrombie, Scott Lynch, Stephen King, Raymond E. Feist, Jim Butcher, Stephen Erickson, David Eddings, Tad Williams, Terry Brooks, Susanna Clarke, Naomi Novik, Brent Weeks, Brian McClellan, Victoria Schwab, Andrei Sapkowski, Mervyn Peake, Mikhail Ender, J.M. Barrie, Jonathan Swift, Hans Christian Andersen, or even the brothers fucking Grimm. These are 22 names that should be frankly auto-include on a list like this. The 100 top fantasy books. These people should define the list. Additionally, while some authors and even some series got multiple entries on this list, Terry Pratchett's Discworld wasn't included, neither was Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives. The flagrant ignorance present in the construction of this list, which was apparently put together by people in the industry, is astounding. The fact is, this list was built entirely for one purpose, and one purpose only: to promote diversity and appeal to the social justice movements. Despite the 24 prominent and influential authors I've already named above that were snubbed by this list, and others that barely got a mention, such as Robert Jordan having only the first Wheel of Time book make this list, which no fan of the series would ever claim was his best, this list still found the space to include 2 books by Tomi Adeyemi, 3 books by N.K. Jemisin, The Poppy War and its sequel by R.F. Kuang both made the list, Sabaa Tahir and Nnedi Okorafor each have 2 books make the list. Other names, some of them I'm sure to butcher: Tasha Shuri, Fonda Lee, Hafsa Fazal, Susan E., Roshani Choksi, Akawi Emzi, Silva Mwani Garcia, Isabel Abinez are all on this list. Notice something about all of these names, other than the fact that you haven't heard of most of them. They're all non-white women. 3 of them were on the fucking panel that did the voting. This isn't a top 100 list. It's a top 100 social justice revisionist historical rewrite of the fantasy genre, in which Time magazine ignores the influence of white men in order to pander to, promote and virtue signal about black women. This couldn't have been more fucking transparent without them actively stating at the beginning that they were going to ignore white men and to a lesser extent white women who write from a European perspective. Sure, some avoided the call. Tolkien was given 3 different entries on the list out of necessity, probably to lend the list some credibility early on. Amazingly, J.K. Rowling wasn't removed from the list completely, which is a shock considering how much the left hates her at the moment and how many people didn't make the list. A few notable white people are given a little bit of credit, but the list is heavily biased towards black women especially. African fantasy, or anything linked to Africa, is given way more attention, and YA fantasy releases, since the social justice media took hold, make up a massive portion. More than half the books on this list were published after the year 2000, with 30 out of 100 books on this list being published in the last 5 years. Oh, and don't think the pandering ends with what I've said so far. Go back and listen to all the names, the huge list of names of massively important fantasy authors they left off. It's worth remembering just who they deemed unworthy for this list. Then remember that they gave Ken Liu 2 books in the list. Marlon James made the list. He was also on the voting panel, by the way. And Evan Winter made the list, and he's only been publishing for the last 2 years. So some men did make the list, so long as they were non-white, of course. Now, I want to make it very clear, many of these books are well regarded. I also point out, I've read almost none of them. This isn't a judgment on the quality of the books or the authors in question. Some of them may well deserve to be on this list. Cassandra Clare most definitely didn't, of course. Her books are absolute shite. And yes, she made the list, but of course she did. She was on the panel that did the fucking voting, so there's no surprise there. The fact of the matter is this. Time magazine isn't making a top 100 list here. They're virtue signalling and cross-promoting mainly non-white, mainly female authors, the majority of which are fairly new to the genre, with a list of books that are still unproven and actively on sale right now with sequels currently in production. This isn't a piece about the genre, it's a marketing push, an attempt at pushing fantasy readers into reading more social justice approved, far left pandering, anti-male, anti-white literature. And yes, I mean that. Just listen to the bile N.K. Jemisin gives out when claiming her Hugo Award if you want to see how much she believes herself to be an underprivileged, oppressed person. Incidentally, she was on the panel that did the voting as well, and she is literally the only other person other than J.R.R. fucking Tolkien to appear on this list 3 times. Oh, by the way, don't forget N.K. Jemisin is a black woman. Just to drill that home. This is nothing more than the shifting sands of the culture war, a move by extremists to undermine and ignore the achievements and influences of people based on their gender and race in the name of their supposed progressive equality. It's fucking sick, and Time magazine should be ashamed of itself. That's all I have to say on that. Thanks for watching.